I recently put my daughter in daycare. I didn't want to do it, but being that I'm a single parent, I don't have much of a choice. After dubious research, I found a daycare center that seemed like a good fit. It was run by a girl named Wendy, and she seemed fairly popular in the neighborhood, as there were a number of kids there when I went to investigate. One of the things I particularly liked about it was the fact that they had security cameras set up around the center so that parents could access them and check on their kids. It quickly became an obsession of mine. All the kids wore jackets that the daycare provided because the air conditioner had been on the fritz, so it was quite cold there. But it was easy to tell which little girl was mine. I loved being able to watch my daughter play with the other kids as I worked, and it gave me peace of mind knowing that she was doing alright. I couldn't keep my eyes glued to the screen the entire time, but in passing I saw that she made a friend she played with almost every single day. And she even had a favorite toy. It was a little medicine ball that she and her friend would toss back and forth. They played with it every day. After about a week, things seemed to be going quite well. My little girl had started recently grasping potty training and was more well behaved than I'd ever known her to be. Needless to say, I was very impressed with the daycare. That was when she started singing the song. She hummed it at first, and when I asked her what it was, she told me it was a song they taught her at daycare. Eventually, she learned all the words and began to sing. We eat their teeth and eat their bones, and slit their throats inside their homes. We sing this song, and when we're done, we'll go to hell and have more fun. She sang it all the time, no matter how many times I had asked her to stop. It made my skin crawl. Why would they teach a song like this to children? The next day, with the song stuck in my head, I resolved to call Wendy. I wanted to tell her that I disapproved of the song and I didn't want her or anything else like that being taught to my daughter. If it continued, I would be forced to find a new daycare. As I watched the children play on the computer screen, my little girl played with the ball like she always did. I picked up my phone and called the daycare. When Wendy answered, I told her about my concern. She was incredibly polite about it and said that one of the other children had been going around singing it, and she said she thought it was from a movie or something. But she was working on putting a stop to it because that song was definitely not for children. She said it disturbed her as much as it did me. I'd been pacing around my office as I spoke to her, and just as we were saying goodbye, I looked back down at the screen and noticed something odd. The Wendy on the screen was not on her phone, but instead she was helping a child with his juice box. She said goodbye and hung up the phone, and I watched the cameras, not reciprocating her farewell, but transfixed on the screen in front of me. I stared at my daughter and her playing with the ball, and I tried to think of how many times I'd seen her drop it as they tossed it back and forth. I didn't think I'd seen that happen very much. And the kid in the corner was always in the corner, working on that same puzzle. How long had he been working on that puzzle? That's when I began to suspect that instead of watching a live feed, I'd been watching a recording. The story takes place about 2 years ago. Luckily the guy's been caught, but I still have an uneasy feeling every time I enter my own home. So as I said, about 2 years ago my friend, let's call him Tommy, came over. I was around 10 years old while Tommy was 11. The two of us were inseparable, partners in crime, the two musketeers. So when I had seen on the television that morning that an armed and dangerous man had somehow escaped the courthouse jail, we immediately went into action, setting up defenses and readying our armory. And by that I mean we stacked all the Nerf guns I owned on my bunk bed and readied ourselves in case some man burst into our home unexpectedly. We sat there for hours, unmoving. If we were in the military, we would have been given medals of honor. Around 5:20ish, my mother returned home from work. We thought our job defending was over. How very wrong we were, though. My mother told us that because her and her father were going out to dinner, that Tommy would be spending the night. For then, it seemed like a sleepover, but for us, it seemed like we were going back to war. Shortly after they left, we had a meeting and we decided that we were going to need reinforcements. And by that, we meant my neighbor. We'll call him Roger. Now, I wasn't as close to Roger as I was to Tommy, but he would usually be willing to join us on our crazy ventures if the time called for it. This was not one of those times. Tommy and I had arrived at Roger's house and I rang the doorbell our usual 7 times, just to make sure they got the message. Roger's mother arrived at the door and gave us the worst possible news. Roger was grounded for a week. Tommy and I were devastated, but we knew it only meant that we'd shoulder the responsibility ourselves. On our way back to the house, I decided I'd look up on my phone how to make a Molotov cocktail, seeing as they were my favorite video games at the time and it seemed like a good idea. I felt around in my pockets and I noticed my phone was missing. No big deal, I probably left it at the house. Tommy and I returned to my house and walked upstairs to my room. I told him to send a text to my phone and we'd see where the ding would come from. That's when things became odd. Tommy sent the text and while we didn't hear a ding, it wasn't long after before the message said, "Read, 8:02 p.m. Tommy was just as confused as I was, seeing as we were both sure that I had left it there. Tommy asked if maybe I left it at Roger's and I told him I hadn't brought it out then. It couldn't have fallen out of my pocket either. We'd been walking on the sidewalk and I would have heard the sound of it dropping. Tommy sent another text, thinking that maybe the first one had glitched somehow. There was no response other than the quick little, "Read, 8:14 p.m. At this point, I began wondering if Tommy had taken my phone as a joke. It wasn't his style, but I still wouldn't put it past him. I asked if he had taken it, and Tommy denied it, swearing up and down he'd never take something like that as a joke. While I was inclined to believe him, seeing as he was my best friend, it was still the only explanation that made sense. It was then that Tommy accused me of pranking him, making it seem like I had hidden my own phone just to mess with him. I shut Tommy's idea down pretty quick by telling him I would have hidden his phone if I was going to mess with him. Tommy began sending message after message. Read, 8:14 p.m. Read, 8:29 p.m. Read, 8:36 p.m. Tommy sent one more message and this time we heard the ding. Coming from my closet. Read, 8:42 p.m. Tommy and I ran out of there as fast as we could, knowing that someone was in there who shouldn't have been. We called 911 and explained everything as they sent an officer over. When the man got there, he went inside and not only found the back door open, but my closet door as well. On the floor was a knife from our kitchen and my phone. We were lucky we weren't killed, and after that night, my parents installed a better security system as well as cameras. Tommy wouldn't come over for a month after that. Now things are relatively back to normal, but to this day, I wonder what would have happened if we wouldn't have gone to Roger's house when the guy broke in. What would have happened if we would have fallen asleep instead or hadn't realized that my phone was missing. My grandfather told me a story once as we sat around the campfire in his backyard in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear and each star twinkled in the purple sky with a full fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy and gravelly, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide dark eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. "Way back when I was a boy, about your age," he began, "I lived outside of the Apache reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from war and set about raising horses and cattle on 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside, with dirt good for growing thorn bush and not much else. One night my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip into town, about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek and somewhat abandoned farmstead. The fire sparkled and a log cracked, jolting me out of the story. "What's next?" I asked. "Settle down, boy. You'll hear soon enough." Pa and I were driving an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember too when the engine began to sputter and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. "Dang it," Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road as it coasted to a halt. "Stay here, son," as he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down and a cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up carrion, like one of them dead bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crows pecked enough holes in their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too. The back of my neck felt itchy and my face started to get hot. The wind stopped blowing and I hung still and heavy with the stink filling the cab. "Pa?" I said. "Pa? Pa?" There was no answer. My heart started beating and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, in my chest. Boy, I tell you, I never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam. Not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over to my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road through both dim beams of light, across the partly open domed hood. Grandfather paused. He spit a fat wad of tobacco spit off to his side as he looked pensively into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath and I gasped for air. The night was cool, but I was sweaty and clammy. "Well, what happened? What about your father? What did you see?" He sighed. "A creature." He shook his head. "You have to understand, boy. There are legends, old legends, older than the rocks out in the valley. Older still than Crazy Horse and Sittin' Bull. Than the old chiefs and their shamans. The Apache, the Hopi, the Cherokee. And all them old tribes and First Peoples, they told tales, old stories. About dark magic. A deal made with old spirits of blood sacrifice to gain power. Old power. Enough to fight each other and the Spaniards. And later the white men that came for their land and women. They called them..." He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath and bodied forward into his tale. Across the fire and the sky and the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and old mountains. He bodied forward. They called them skinwalkers, shape changers. Old warriors resurrected as skinless men, all sinew and muscle, walking on deer legs with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote. But messed up, boy. Long and malformed snouts, teeth like a bowie knife, long arms and standing 7 foot, even hunched over. They'd gut the old cowboys and white riders. They'd run through bullets and sabers, part the Spanish armor like it was a potato sack. Wily, too. They could change their voice to match a person you knew, or might know. Boy, that's what I saw. Big and fast. Only for a second, it ran across the road. Gray and mottled, muscles flexing under its legs, hooves clomping on the road, stringy, muscled, hunched shoulders. And it turned, looked right into the cab, looked right into my eyes, and I swear, boy, I swear it grinned at me. I sank into my seat in shock and fear, shaking. I knew death was near. The air was electric. I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before the lightning comes and blows a tree to smithereens. Charged and full with power. I yelled for my paw, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I was shaking as my grandfather told this story. He was still there, so I knew he lived, but the supernatural always fascinated me, and even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but Also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so they could take others. Not for long, the legends say. Maybe an hour before the soul of the skin they wore would come looking for their mortal shell before going to whatever hell awaited them. Though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened and I jerked my head to the left, putting my fists up to fend off an attack. "Son, it's me," my father said, before climbing into the cab. He grabbed the steering wheel and pulled himself in awkwardly, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard, boy. Your great-grandfather was a good man, treated me and my ma right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of men in Poland when he freed all of them camps. And now I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your ma, as he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it onto the road, and our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom? No, boy, I knew. Because out the window, out the corner of my eye, I seen that beast running 50 miles an hour right next to the car, looking at me with them yellow eyes and a grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us, boy. My pa kept his eyes on the road, locked straight forward. Son, he said, don't look at it. Do not look at it. That's how I knew, boy.